Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Live, where I can interact with you and probably insult you. But nonetheless, I am thinking about a lot of things today as we are 3 weeks within another election where there's no one to be particularly excited about, yet voter turnout will be high. It's actually interesting listening to bourgeois and liberal journalism on this, because on some ways they're totally fixated on voter turnout being low because people are not particularly excited about this election, and yet they're also reporting that there's going to be like an 80% intended turnout, which is it going to be, motherfuckers. Historically speaking, and I have a whole video about this coming up, actually we should expect at least pretty close to last time on election turnout, and that's despite candidates being not particularly likable. The historical norm on that is kind of complicated, but in the 20th century, the things that correlate the strongest with depressed election turnout is conscription, not even war, specifically conscription. And yeah, moderately or completely disgusted is more accurate. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anyone who's completely happy with it except for the diehard partisans on either side, and the diehard partisans on either side are a little bit of a joke, even within those two broad-based coalitions. But when we talk about the left TM, which I always think we're always both having this weird game where the left is always about to be, but never really is in the West. But it is something to think about the difference between, say, France Unbowed, which we don't talk about very much, and you know, particularly after Macron did that outreach to Le Pen's party, compared to the DSA. I mean, France Unbowed, in the same time since Mélenchon became a key figure in 2016. After he released his book about the era of the peepers in 2014, French Unbowed has grown to about 600,000 people in a country with a much smaller population than the United States. Whereas in the same time period, the DSA grew to about 100,000 people and then has collapsed to about 56K in less than 3 years due to their inability to restructure themselves in a way that makes any sense. They both act like a party and not like a party simultaneously, which means that they don't do either very well. And this shows up in the debates between the ideological factions in the DSA, which have been so taken up by people who have spent most of their lives almost entirely online that they think that death-threatening comrades is a good idea. Or on the right, the DSA right, the Democratic adjacent side, they are gloating in public as if barely winning election in New York somehow represents the entirety of the organization. It's all kind of a waste of fucking time. But I want you to look at the real numbers, and this is something you should be thinking about. How did the left, that was ostensibly in command of the largest percentage of the vote in a long time, end up going the same way as the Rainbow Coalition with Jesse Jackson, not even as well as the McGurven campaign? And if Britain is an indication of the Anglophone left's future, y'all about to be liquidated, motherfuckers. Also, and I don't mean that you're about to be killed. I don't think that's actually all that likely, even under a Trump presidency, despite what liberals might try to get you to be afraid of. I mean that you've served your political purpose in giving life to the center by making it seem like there's a possibility of a real debate in the Democratic Party. And there's a whole lot of people who've made their careers and their media presence off of that debate, both on the force to vote and on the be pragmatic side. Neither one of them are actually pragmatic. It's the biggest ado about a parliamentary congressional stunt that I've ever heard in my goddamn life. But we spent 2.5 years fucking arguing about it as if we weren't already aware that Congress wasn't going to pass Medicare for all or any variant thereof as early as 1996 or 4. I was alive in the 90s, unlike many of you, so I know that we had a debate about socialized healthcare all the way back then. So let us come about and understand the situation. Another thing that I've been trying to point out is the appearance of diehard sectarians for people who just a few years ago were barely even Bernie-crats is a sign of left failure. It's actually a very similar pattern to what you've seen in white evangelical circles, where the only people left in white evangelical circles are pretty much crazy, even for Christians. It actually is where only the most ideologically sectarian people who are also given to fads and anything that can justify their own self-flattering belief that they see through the bullshit that they were just conned by a few months ago. Yeah, I mean, the UK left is liquidated. That's what I mean. Like, that's what I was saying. It's gone. It's not. I mean, you know, not just parliamentary speaking. Like, I mean, I'm sure somehow the SWP UK will survive, as will the rump of the people who make up the Communist Party Great Britain Provisional Committee. You know, who do the Weekly Worker. I mean, that's been as down to as little as 30 people and still survived. But my point is, as a mass movement, Corbyn was actually a sign of something ending, just like Occupy was a sign of something ending. And the resurrection of the new communist movement, which this current Marxist-Leninist trend really does mirror, is also a sign of something being stalled. The reversion back, if you compare us to France, like a lot of people will characterize Mélenchon's movement as like the same as the Mouf's move, you know, populism, except Mélenchon explicitly does not use those terms. He still insists on that he's a historical materialist. I was just talking to someone who's active in France earlier today on the phone to get a better sense of it, because I feel like for all the excitement about the Front Popular, that the Front Popular in France didn't work like historical Marxist-Leninist popular fronts did from 1936 forward. Although we have to remind ourselves it was the French who ended third periodism pretty much unilaterally in 1936. Then it was adopted by the Comintern a little later. But nonetheless, what Mélenchon's doing actually isn't the same thing as that, even though it has the same name. Hi, David. I mean, DV. And this is something that we have to ask ourselves about. Why has that gone so differently? Why does France Unbowed have 600,000 people in the same time period that the DSA went to 100,000 and lost 50,000 and a population of 330 million? All right. That's a big fucking question. Why did that happen? All right. You know, I'm one of the few people who's just like, God damn it, DSA just split already. like, you know, I'm tired of your Twitter wars. All I see is that building massive Twitter accounts that go nowhere. Nonetheless, there we go. You don't think much of the recent RCP IMT? I mean, they're not mass at all. And what I will say that the RCP RCA all used to be the IMT is the only Trotskyist group that's really survived the self-liquidation of Trotskyism into the DSA and the Anglophone left. And so that's a little bit impressive. But at the same time, like, ideological sectarian formations have been a road to nowhere for 100 fucking years. I mean, even before the Bolsheviks made it look like it might be viable. And that's a misunderstanding of what the Bolsheviks were, if we're being honest. it's, I mean, I see the, oh, this is actually a good point. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about this. The difference is American left operate in American federalism, whereas France is a parliamentary system. All the strategies they used in development in parliamentary systems. That's true, except that the action party system in French Unbowed is not parliamentary at all. They don't grow based off parliamentary growth. So their ability to do electoral interventions is based on the difference between a congressional system in America and the parliamentary system in Europe. But why has left populism in general in the parliamentary system in Europe gone down the way of the dodo in less than a decade, except in France? There is something else there. We're not talking about French Unbowed the way we talk about Syriza or Podemos. Now, I'm not saying that French, like Mélenchon, should be our one and only hope, nor do I think that strategy is going to work in the United States. But I think the idea that, oh, the DSA is just like tied into this American system, well, that's partly because they refuse to do pre-political work, that they want to go directly into canvassing, or they focus on national issues or only local issues in big urban areas with a high bar of entry, and not in, diffuse other areas. I mean, Benjamin Studebaker, for all that you might see as a fraud, is actually quite accurate, that leftists often choose to primarily go to areas with high bars of entry. Thinking that somehow you have to start building a grassroots movement to avoid localism by entering fields that are almost impossible to win without having large scale, nebulous, molecular groups to deal with. And particularly in a federal, I mean, this is a point about the federalized thing that I think you're really right, New List, is, or New List, is that you have to deal with the fact that you have to operate in 50 states in vastly different conditions with even vastly different electoral legal constraints. So this is the, are you going to do the pre-political work that makes political work possible? The DSA is willing to do some of it, but you have the partyists, who I am sympathetic with and think are in the main part right, but are still trying to like seemingly do this in like New York and California, and you have the Democratic adjacentists who actually understand local political terrains better, but seem to be actively and purposely deluded about national political campaigns. And that tension never doesn't get like reconciled at all. And what it turns into, since it can't go anywhere, is internal hostility and gloating. And it's not like we didn't see decades of that in newspapers and shit before even the fucking internet. I've been going back and studying what happens to the new communist movement in the America and Canada in the 1980s, and the various groups that like existed for 3 years and liquidated themselves. Just like I've been kind of interested in learning more about the history of the French ultra left and how a lot of that went. And the national versus local tension misses the point that like national politics exists and operates within a local constraint, particularly in federalized systems. So I don't know what to tell people. So we get in the discourses where people are doing slogans about read X instead of read Y. I mean, Ben Burgess Day was like, read Marx and less, read more Marx and read less Frantz Fanon. And I was just like, no, read more both. Like, look, there are theorists that I don't love. I have very mixed opinions about Domenico Lacerto. I think there's some good books and there's some terrible books. I like some of the things he says and not others. And even the books I don't love that are kind of popular right now, partly because Trotskyist editors and major presses try to suppress them for so long, have come about. You can get something from all of those books, even though I think like this construction of Western Marxism as an answer to the failures of Marxism is basically a theodicy that kind of removes the failure of the left for not reading good Soviet or Chinese Marxists. But then when you actually read these texts, they're not referring to Soviet or Chinese Marxists, except for like the head leaders of the party, and they're not going through the systemic history of Chinese communism in any way. You actually still have to go to this regular bourgeois liberal academics for that shit, or read reports from the various Chinese congresses if you can get them translated into English, or if you are fluent enough to read Mandarin. So how's the discourse doing us? Well, it's not doing a goddamn thing. This is like the way discourse degeneracy comes out in the macho posturing that we see in it is very much what you'd expect when you have a bunch of grad students running into a bunch of unemployed men and smashing them together on the internet, which is how you get a lot of weird marginal modal politics. And if you could hook that up to something more socially rigorous and meaningful than ideological posturing, then yeah, you really could do something with those people. It's not like they're like lumpen and lost. They're the reserve army of labor. But like, there's also a tendency towards atomization and loneliness where you identify with a political ideology in some name of the father way almost, that you often stack some dead dude to, just plaster that face on that shit. And instead of dealing with it and wrestling with it and auto-critiquing yourself, you view the ideology as an extension of yourself, because yourself has also been hollowed out into a brand because of a lack of social relation. And grad school does this almost naturally because it's systemically built to keep you busy and atomized and working for other people in such a way that you can focus on your own intellectual development and nothing else. So it makes sense. But when you like see that spread throughout the culture, it's usually a sign of other social malaise. I didn't say Studebaker was a fraud. Where did you get that from? I said depending on how you feel the feel about him. I think Studebaker's right. I like Studebaker personally. I didn't think I was going to either, actually. I mean, I can tell you that the thing about Benjamin. Ben, I was very hesitant to interview Ben the first time, and when I read his book and then I talked to him, and I was like, oh, I really get you. I think we're actually on the same page. In fact, if anything, he's maybe more systemically black-pilled than me. So no, I'm not implying he's a fraud. I'm not implying Dominica Lacerda's a fraud. I'm not implying Ben Burgess is a fraud. I'm just saying, you have to look at these things regardless of your opinion about these individuals as people. Well, I mean, someone's talking about the BLM stuff. I find it interesting how the left has like buried its own relationship to BLM because of what happened afterwards, not during. But yeah, I mean, I've seen that personally when I was here in Salt Lake. I've talked about we used to do. I used to work with a local group called the United Panthers and another local group of activists who were tied into the Brown Berets, and we, and we largely did stuff like immigration advocacy and stuff like that. And the DSA showed up once to one of our events, and they were clustered almost obviously as a snowflake in this event. And it was actually in my neighborhood, which is predominantly like Nicaraguan and South Mexican and Polynesian and Somali and Ethiopian. Like, I live on the brown side of Salt Lake, which I know people are surprised exists, but it very much exists. The Pandaria down the street from me, you pretty much need to speak Spanish to go into. And they really stood out. I mean, they tried. I'll give them credit for trying. But instead of doing that, they decolonized their name and removed DSA and became DSSLC. So, we removed the word America, and that was decolonization. I'm not making that up. And like as a symbolic gesture, I guess fine, but it's so symbolic, particularly here. And honestly, when I go and do stuff today, I'm either depending on union people or I'm depending on groups I don't even necessarily always get along with, like the PSL. I don't actually see the DSA that much anymore. I used to. Before COVID, I did a lot, but not after it. Yeah, David, I agree. The fact that we can't engage with Studebaker is actually part of the problem. That it's actually funny. I was thinking about this whole purity fetish thing, and I was like, the funny thing about the people who harp on the purity fetish is they also themselves have a purity fetish where they are trying to block off whole histories of the left-wing tradition as not engageable because of things that are tangential to it or because of narratives about the CIA, which in some cases are true, in some cases aren't. If I had to go after everyone who ever got a Fulbright scholarship who was and thus had some relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency indirectly, who was ever a Marxist, I would be going after anyone who touched academia at any high level, including some famous decolonial thinkers. We have to be very careful with that line of argument. It's not that sometimes it's not true. It's just we have to be careful with it and contextualize it. And you can't always know. And also, like, that one, we have to separate historiographic categories from history. We can't treat historiographic categories as things that are facts, like events or things. So when we talk about like Western Marxism, we have to know that that's an active constructed category, and it's an active constructed category actually invented by Perry Anderson, ironically, to delegitimize 60s and 70s Marxist scholarship out of the Soviet Union, and to create a counter tradition to that, and thus lop off the interrelation between Soviet Marxism and Bolshevik Marxism and what was going on, prior to the New Left and even in the early parts of the New Left. Some people who get critiqued by Lacerdo, and I'm not saying that Lacerdo book is without merit, by the way. I actually, I'm rereading it and trying to parse my problems with it and what I like about it, because there is stuff I do like about it. But, throw as much shit up for code as you want. But I do think that we have to deal with that these were not obvious constructions, and some of these people sour over time, and some of this thought is in dialogue with various elements. Like you look at Bloch, for example. Bloch is one of the few, quote, Western Marxists who actively chose until 1956 to live in East Germany and not West. Like also like Heinrich Grossmann and Brecht. Like they chose to live in East Germany after World War II. And it was Bloch only left when the contradictions around the Hungarian uprising led to, which I think is a contradictory movement on both sides, actually. I don't think we can paint it as like either good Soviet Union against bad Hungarian fascists, which I've literally heard, or pure, good, liberal, emancipatory socialist in Hungary versus evil Stalinist mob under Khrushchev, which I've also heard a lot too. When I've actually researched that, it's a very mixed and confusing movement with people trying to orient themselves to different sides. It doesn't fit a simple heroic narrative. All right. There's a lot of movements like that. Any fucking social movement of any size is going to be like that. And so Like, do you not expect a social movement to have the contradictions of general society in that social movement? Ooh, okay. Let's see what else is coming up. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you can get guys, use your fucking libraries. Use your libraries, and if not, there's some Russian sites that you can access that will help you. That's all. I'm not telling you anything more about that. But yeah. I mean, one of the things about a stalled social movement that tells you a lot about its stalling, right, is when you can't build um uh when you have to rely on very idiosyncratic readings of prior sectarian movements to justify where you're at, and it's not growing. I talk about my own relationship to be, I used to consider myself a left communist, kind of almost in the Bordigist tradition. I very much left that over time. And one of the reasons why was this idea of the historically invariant program, which Bordiga attributes to Marx. And I'm sorry, I've read Marx's letters. Marx actually does specifically talk about the need to adjust programs to their specific national context and modes of development and language, because that's how you're going to have to get people to engage. And even though nationalism was in many ways outside of England and France, still in this contestation between civic and organic nationalism and all this in the 19th century when Marx was writing. I mean, we got to remember Germany and Italy and most of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were not national polities yet. Like, they were still basically late medieval, early modern empires. Um, and the national polities with national consolidation, like England and France, were also late medieval, early modern empires, which civically and synthetically built an organic subject that was not there priorly. And, at least on the level of culture, at least by the definition given to us for genocide by the UN, would have been considered genocidal today. In fact, one of the weird things about the UN's definition of genocide that I kind of struggle with is that all national consolidation projects, even ones that would not be exterminationist in the literally killing of people, would actually probably meet the UN definition of genocide. So it's something to think about what that was doing when it was used in the late 1940s to kind of freeze geopolitics and like the national set to what existed at the time. Speaking of East Germany, Jar, have you read Triumph of Evil by Austin Murphy? Nope, I have not. All right. Why do I struggle with what definition? I don't know. I'm reading your comments. I'm trying to figure out which of you are commenting to each other. Uh, what do you think we could glean from utopian socialism? I mean, I did a whole podcast on this back when Doug Lane and I still worked together before COVID. And one of the things I said is, if you look at the conditions of what they critiqued utopian socialism for, some of it wasn't entirely true. Like, some of these utopian socialists actually did have notions of history. We considered them wrong, but they did have historical narratives. The big thing I think we can learn is you need a positive orientation in addition to a negative one. I've been getting in arguments online with anti-imperialists when I say anti-imperialism is good and we should support even sometimes reactionary movements that are against empire. But or at least I wouldn't say support, but get out of the way of. However, like that's not a positive politics. Like just stopping genocide by itself stops one particular political atrocity, right? Um, how do you build a world after that that doesn't allow that to happen anymore? You know, what is the role of everybody in there? If your politics says 90% of the population just needs to get out of the way, that's not a politics. Heidi Matthews has pointed out that genocides don't have to be exterminationist because the UN definition is not exterminationist. In so much that there's any actual definition of genocide, it is in the UN Charter, and cultural genocide is in there. And no one has to die for that. Like trying to erase a language would count. Um, now, do I think that should be in the anti-genocide accords? I mean, do I think it's good to erase someone's culture? No, I absolutely do not. I'm not arguing for that. You know, but do I think that that's the same as, you know, I don't know, bombing babies in hospitals, running death camps, doing marches under people in conditions that they can't survive? No, I don't. I don't think it's remotely the same. Are we back to the Raquel Lacerdo kitsch? I mean, look, I'm not my stuff on Raquel and Lacerdo. I've talked to some Raquel students actually, and I know that he's distanced himself from where the Midwestern Marxism, where a lot of people have used him. Um, what would bourgeois anti-imperialism be? Jay Fonda throwing a passion and support for Ho Chi Minh. I mean, yeah, liberal anti like Marxists aren't the only people who've ever thought about anti-imperialism. Although the contradiction and capitalism is that there is no way that that a capitalist system can stay closed if it's going to grow. So it's going to expand in an imperial manner eventually, no matter what. The idea of shopkeeper capitalism, you know, or even autarkic industrial capitalism, you would run out of materials you need within your own polity pretty quickly. And if you don't trade with people and utilize in our system international trade leverage, which is almost inherently imperial, you're going to do it by gunboat diplomacy, which is direct neocolonialism. I don't really see a way around that. Like, um, because otherwise, you're going to have a hard time growing your economy. And with capitalist economies, if you don't grow, you die. And that is kind of unique to capitalism when you compare it to other kinds of human formations, which could be relatively steady state. Why do you care about everyone else so much? Isn't this a poem on the deck chair of the Titanic as she returns home from work in a Hawaiian t-shirt? Why the fuck are you talking? Why do you care about what I care about so much? Politics is inherently social, Broham. Asking someone who's engaged in political or social thought why they care about what other people think. You don't have a personhood without caring about what other people are. Your entire selfhood is actually only possible by running up against other people. If you're isolated by yourself for any long period of time, you will create artificial people to deal with, or you will fucking die. Look, I get it. We live in a society where 10% of blue collar men haven't worked in 5 years. Something like 20% of them haven't had a meaningful relationship in 5 years, don't have kids, don't have families, and a lot of ones that do have kids and do have families feel trapped. I get it. I understand. You know, I'm in a union. I work with those kind of people all the fucking time. And I teach kids. So I see, the homes that produce kids, right? Like, I get it. I have sympathy. And I do have sympathy for that. The reason why a lot of people feel so alone is because they are. They really are. And some of it's on them, but a lot of it's not, right? I mean, it's the kind of habits that are sold to you when you're highly immiserated. I have a lot of junkies in my life, man. Like in my own family, I feel you. Um, I'm not one of these people who was born uh, from college educated parents. My mother got her her degree when she was 40, when I was 19. And my stepfather has an associate's degree, I think, maybe. And my biological father doesn't have a degree at all. That was a salesman and a con artist. So I feel you. I feel you. I don't come out of a rarefied world. I mean, I exist in one kind of now. I'm not rich by any stretch of the imagination. I rent my place. This is my office attic. Like, I get it, but I'm not immiserated at this point in my life. So, I mean, I understand. I have a lot of sympathy for that. I don't want to turn this on like mocking a person for their social alienation, right? That's just shitty. It's a shitty thing to do. Yeah. Stochastic terrorism will do you real good, bro. All right. Yeah, I mean, human social life is, I mean, it's in the title, it's social. Um there's no human being who's ever done everything for themselves. If there was, you wouldn't have heard about them. I mean, even like, I was thinking about that hermit who like lived with no human contact for like a decade. Well, how did he survive? Right? He poached, which, okay, fine. I don't really have that much of a problem with that on a moral level. And he broke into people's homes. So even there, he's not able to reproduce himself, even as a hermit, on his own accord. Like monks and stuff who do hermitage are supported either by their own wealth today or historically by their communities supporting them because they thought they got some spiritual benefit from doing it. Like, but no one is completely and utterly self-made. The fact that you have to speak a fucking language which you cannot come up with by yourself or people wouldn't understand it, uh, in and of itself indicates that, right? So it's kind of in the category now, and I don't have to tolerate any of your bullshit. I'm going to, but I don't have to. You don't have to tolerate mine. All right. Oh, capitalism definitely reinforces antisocial angst. Liberalism reinforces of antisocial angst. Like, the reason why, like, there's an interesting debate between Colin Drum and I about whether or not Hobbes is the first liberal, because yes, Hobbes uses every liberal conceit for anti-liberal means, but Hobbes's whole metaphysics is based on individuals as social atoms, as completely self-caused. and views competition between individuals and the need for society as imposed upon them because they are free floating atoms, not in relation to each other, but just completely, totally in solitary in the void and competing for resources, which is actually somewhat true for human social groupings, but is not true for humans in the individual level at all. We inherently form social groupings. So, this is something that we have to deal with um in this, and it when I turn on this is like a debate between me and the class a little bit, because I'm like, some of this is liberatory from the personalism of the medieval period, but some of this is also just frankly delusional about the atomization of man. Trade union consciousness is often going to be protectionist because it's interested in its own comparative advantage, and it would be wrong not to be. But that's why Marxists always said it was a fundamental limitation to the movement. Hobbes' thought is most clarified through his radicalization of Machiavelli. Yeah, I mean, and also his literal physicalism. I mean, like, you should take Hobbes's metaphysical statements about like God being a physical being and the humans being made up of like self-imposed atoms in his image as actual literal beliefs. Um, the idea that people organically just inherently get along under harsh conditions is kind of hot, like it's just bullshit. But always remember that none of these categories are organic; they're imposed upon you. Like, you know, it's very, you see this, for example, when I used to teach African students here in the States, and Black Lives Matter people would come and talk to them about blackness, and they had no idea. I mean, yes, they were proud to hear about Africa, they were proud to be black, but when they were talking about like, oh, we're black, we're united, we don't have these other identities, the African students were like, yes, the fuck we do, right? Because these identities are very contingent and built on histories that are um they're material, they're not just ideological, but like, you know the, when one self-recognition approaches another, it's often super alienating. Whiteness, took off in the transatlantic slave trade, right? Particularly when you can no longer use Christendom to justify the taking of slaves, and participating in the Portuguese buying slaves from the Congo Empire. Uh, but it became very useful as an attempt to unify unrelated identities in the quote settler world, right? I mean, and I spoke quote settler world not because I don't believe that settlerism is real. I definitely do, but because that's where that is more useful. You try to import that back into Europe, and it kind of doesn't entirely work. You also see this like the Pan Asian and Pan African diaspora. They run up into the wall of the traditions in that area because a lot of that stuff developed in diasporic context. Sometimes African nationalism is pro Pan African, and sometimes it's not. Just like sometimes European nationalism is pro Pan Europeanism, and sometimes it's not. If you want to read some very weird debates about this, go read like the European New Left debates about national identity and whiteness, because it's wild, but it's kind of a mirror image of some of the debates we are having now. Sometimes when you look into your enemies, you start seeing the problems that you're dealing with in yourself. Well, why would ADOS want anything to do with Pan Africanism? Because the ADOS, American descendants of slaves, are definitionally a post transatlantic phenomenon. Africa is not. Um, I mean, I feel weird as the, like, you know, off white guy talking about this, but yeah. All right, open-ended question. Do you see a phenomenological type story like an individual traveling the world in fiction as misrecognition narcissistic? Usually it is special pleading. I don't know that it's always narcissism, but, like, we've all encountered the outsider slash imperial slash colonial slash even just benevolent but weirdo fucking privileged person view on other cultures and other encounters. Is there a way to disrupt interpolation? Definitionally, not really. I mean, I'd be honest with you, that's part of Althusser that's always, like, made me wonder if it doesn't lead to some kind of political quietism, because the if you really take that interpretation to the most logical extreme, um, political action becomes something that is just stochastic, that it just happens because of the aleatory movement of atoms or whatever that creates a possible contingency of change, because otherwise, following his theory, there's no way out. Uh, not yes, Unround is great. One of the last albums I bought live, believe it was Unwound and You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead. Maybe. But anyway, I one of the last albums I bought after seeing them at a live show when I was still doing that in my 20s, um, was Unwound and Leaves Turn Inside You. And yes, it's pretty great. I love that album. I was listening to it the other day. Let's just talk about random music from 20 fucking years ago. But yeah. Interpolation is the idea that many ideologies, that you will play a role in them whether you intend to or not, or embrace the ideology or not. The classic example is the cop calls out to you, and the fact that you answer the cop at all means you've acknowledged the cop. Biggie or Tupac? I always like Tupac better, but I don't really have strong opinions. Unwound is playing important. Well, we are old enough, drunk Dalek, that you and I's youth is now nostalgia material. We're now in the prime middle age for that shit to happen. So Gen Z loves Deftones. I love Deftones too. Good on Gen Z. Give me hope for the world. Not really. I don't think aesthetic choices matter all that much, but I do love the Deftones. Through the blog age. Thinking about this, about a fundamental difference between. I was actually talking to my friend in France today, and we were talking about a fundamental difference in both social movements and in politics and in subcultural movements, etc. That is a result of the change in logistics, like the change in communication logistics, and how so much of the material physical infrastructure of the world is actually hidden from us, so we think it's ephemeral when it's really not. That's a side question, but that's an important thing to remember. Everything that you do online requires an energy bank and major power sources and a large industrial apparatus to do. If people think we've been digitized and removes us from the industrial productive world, they don't know how the internet really works. But bracket that out for a second, put that over here. The other thing I've noticed is, like, when a lot of us who are in certain age cohorts, because I do think there's a certain way in which this age stuff is also bullshit. There's a way in which it does tell you something about people, and there's a way in which it is still fundamentally fucking arbitrary. We're just carving people up in 15-year chunks. But anyway, back to millennials. One of the difference between, let's say, post-Occupy leftist versus post-COVID young leftist is that a lot of post-Occupy leftists were very online, but they saw the online world as a way to extend things that were happening in the meat space. Whereas a lot of people today actually have the opposite trajectory, where they're hoping the online world can make something in the meat space happen. And while that is a subtle distinction, it is actually a distinction in orientation and how you put stuff together. And it actually matters because, as I've said many times, people ask, well, why don't you use your podcast to organize things here locally in Utah? I have like 40 listeners in Utah out of the 1,000 listeners who might listen to a podcast in a month, right? My audience is diffuse. I actually have more listeners in Toronto, Canada, than I do where I actually live. I have more listeners in New York than I do where I actually live. I have more listeners in Oslo, Sweden, than I do where I actually live. Right? I have very few listeners in California. Californians don't like me, which is funny because I'm on I'm always on shows that are oriented towards the West Coast, and it's really, but like, yeah. It is what it is. So if I was to use that to like try to do my any kind of union or local demo action, what the fuck would it do? Like, it wouldn't, like, I might get some funding for my local demo from it, but I would risk all kinds of exposure that I don't want and get very little of the exposure that I do. Oh no, yeah, you're right. It's not just red activism. It's all over the place. NGOs, think tanks, and political pressure groups do this too, because they confuse. I mean, there's this way in which consciousness raising gets fucking. I will say this: I don't believe in generational politics except for the baby boomers, which is the real only generation. I only really believe their generation in the United States because the post-war conditions were so fucking unique. And the United States had so much wealth, both stolen and also just because everyone else blew their wealth up. So, you know, those conditions will probably never exist again. Some people, I live in California. Well, thank you. What even be thought of as a podcast to break like Quintic Pipeline? Well, it's funny because I was I actually went down. I mean, I don't usually talk about the work I do, but one of the things I did when I first came back to America in 2017, right? You know, I've been gone for almost a decade at that point. I was out of the country for most of the Obama administration, right? And like the first little bit of the Trump administration. And one of the things I did is when I would do poetry tours back then to help my when my publisher would ask me to do that in New Orleans, and I would go and help the Blake Wright clinics and do teach-ins with the DSA there. You know, despite my like ragging on the DSA all the time, I don't have any prohibition against working with the DSA or the PSL or even fucking normie Democrats if it serves my political goals to do so. I just don't join their group or give them money. But I will do education with them. I will do work that will benefit people beyond just benefiting the group. I think that's what, you know, a good independent leftist should do, because you do need to be in organizations, but there's no political organization that I feel is structured in a way that I think it would be responsible for me to subject myself to its party line. And given that I don't think that, that means that I can only work in parapolitical groups, which I think is fine for right now. Oh, yeah. I said to you before, that you were in South Korea when you were a teen, your parents were Moonies. That's intense, man. You should like look me up and we should talk about that off air one day or something, because I'd love to know more. Oh yeah, man. It took me so long. I get both. I love Korea. I love Korea. The personal benefits art for art's sake of proto-utopian communists? Maybe. Uh, what, yeah, Moonies are crazy, but there's a lot of people who are crazy. But yeah, uh, I don't talk a lot of Actually, I would also say the what is it? Uh, Something the Guru's podcast. The podcast that is so centrist, I don't love it all the time. But decoding the Gurus, or yeah, I did a thing on the Moonies. It was pretty useful too. I don't think there's repeating the Arab Spring now. Well, it's just like I was told, I was giving some people shit about trying to bring back old bourgeois rights, and I was told that even Chris Catrone admits that they're not coming back in the way that they used to exist. So yeah. At what point does it make sense to move from independent to affiliated as partisan of the proletariat? That's a good question. I honestly think, like, if there's a mass party, and I mean a real mass party, independent of the ones that we exist today, it would be irresponsible for me not to join it, um, unless it was like a death cult. I wouldn't join a mass death cult. But like in general, uh, oh, can I say more about the old bourgeois whites coming back? Um, I think a lot of that has to do with the contradictions within those rights being played out in such a way that the only thing that gets left is atomized individualism. That, like, all the substantive elements of those rights have been emptied out from their prior communal and relational context, and also emptied out of any requisite duties, because rights do entail duties, right? Um, to the point that they're kind of empty fetishized abstractions at this point, and they've been undone in the structure of society. Like, what does the civil sphere or free speech mean when all speech outlets are effectively privatized dependencies like the one we're on right now? This is a corporate platform. Is China socialist, proto-socialist? Okay, I'm going to take the Chinese Communist Party at its own word and say that it is attempting to build socialism and has not done that yet. It is definitely subject to international capitalism. There are some things about it that are a little different than everywhere else. They're basically the only industrial society left, in the sense that they. I owe this distinction to Joshua Lou McDermott. And I talked about two senses of deindustrialization. Deindustrialization from the point of view of production and society, in which case we have not deindustrialized, and deindustrialization from the point of view of the worker, in which case we have. Like, even if I include logistics workers in the industrial worker cortex, you're still only dealing with 16% of the population. Yet, down from like 40% at its height, or like 37% at its height in the United States. The assumption that a lot of second international socialists had, that the industrial proletariat in specific would be the majority of society, never happened. And part of what the the first revisionism crisis, not the second one, not the one that's all about your personal feelings about Stalin, but the one that's about uh, how you should orient towards capitalism, and whether or not capitalist society could just be transformed organically and evolutionarily into a socialist society or not. It started off in a debate about why the industrial proletariat wasn't becoming the majority of society, even though proletarian wage relations were. All right. So I think one of the things you have to deal with China is there are elements of China that don't even have the same social safety net as, say, Germany. Xi's installed a lot of that social safety net for like rural peasantry and stuff that was dismantled under Deng. It's one of the things that you have to like reconcile when you like treat this as a unified thought that this like Deng and then everyone after Deng is really all the same until Xi. There's big differences between Xi and Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao and of course Deng Xiaoping. And so it's something you kind of have to look at in a more refined light. But of course, everyone wants to claim the same tradition, just like every American politician wants to claim the fucking founding fathers. Of course we do. Yeah, this is a good question. It's important to remember that China is more powerful in regards to the West and the Soviet Union ever was, and yet they aren't promoting revolution abroad. They haven't brought back a Comintern. And I'm not saying this, I don't want to like shit on it because I do think like we should be, I would not go as so far as a lot of the Rockhill Lacerdo people and saying that we shouldn't criticize China because that's historical nihilism. I think that's crazy. I think that's a cop-out in a lot of ways. But I also think we do have to be defensive because I do think there are sincere, real socialists in the PRC, in the CC, in the CPC. I'm going to use the acronym they want to use now. I just checked the U.S. definition. It says cultural destruction does not suffice. Yeah, I mean, I don't even think like not even talking about like 1.5 billion Chinese, right? Just even talking about the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party as one unified autocracy is just not real. And China is kind of a federated system too. I mean, I don't think you can claim to speak to what's going on in China unless you speak Mandarin, and I don't. So take everything I say with that grain of salt. I think it is irresponsible for a commentator like me to be pontificating about the reality of China without learning Mandarin and having some access. But I also admit that it's a much more complicated situation than either the detractors or a lot of time I think the well-meaning and morally correct defenders want to do. I don't want to throw like the Chinese socialist experiment under the bus, but I also don't want to pretend it is not subject to international capital because it absolutely is. Anyway, so cultural destruction does not suffice. Let's actually look up the UN Charter for Genocide. Let's actually look that up together, okay? Because I need to go into this because I've been told cultural destruction is a form of genocide under the UN Charter. And I remember reading that about the international human rights thing. The funny thing, though, I used to teach the international, like the international human rights under the UN, and I laugh because no country's ever done all of it ever. Nobody. So I find it kind of like a weird proposition, but let's look up UN definition. I'll share my screen in a second once I get a good thing of genocide. 1948. No, I don't trust the fucking AI overview. Sometimes it makes shit up. Let's go to the actual definition of genocide and related crimes on the UN website. And let's pull it up and look at it together. This, just like I started actually going to communist texts and reading them out loud, letter by letter, so people can actually not learn to not just trust mine or anyone else's gloss. You can disagree with me because I'm putting the words in front of you. We're going to do that here. All right. Let's pull this up. All right. I'm just going to read it. The word genocide was first coined by the Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944 in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It consists of the Greek prefix genos, meaning race or tribe, and the Latin suffix side, meaning killing. Lemkin developed the term partly in response to Nazi policies of systemic murder of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, but also in response to previous instances in history of targeted actions aimed at the destruction of particular groups of peoples. Later on, Raphael Lemkin led the campaign to have genocide recognized and codified as an international crime. Genocide was first recognized as a crime under international law. Asterisk, international law is kind of a misnomer, in so much that international law is the treaties between nations that are recognized by the General Assembly. But anyway, and so like you guys know, some people aren't subject to everything the UN says. Some people are, blah, 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 including UN members. It was codified as an independent crime in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide. The Genocide Convention. The convention was ratified by 153 states as of April 2022. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, has repeatedly stated that the convention embodies the principles which are part of the customary international law. This means whether or not states have ratified the Genocide Convention, they are all bound as matters of law by a principle that genocide is a crime prohibited under international law, asterisk, if you can enforce it, unasterisk. The ICJ also stated that the prohibition of genocide is preemptory norm of international law, are ust cogens, and subsequently no derogation from it is allowed. The definition of the crime of genocide as contained in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention was a result of negotiating process and reflects a compromise, that's interesting, reached among United Nations member states in 1948 at the time during the drafting of the convention. The genocide is defined in the same terms as the Genocide Convention in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as statutes of other international and hybrid jurisdictions. Many states have also criminalized genocide in their domestic law. Others have yet to do so. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime and Genocide, Article 2. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So even stuff like that whole kill the native, spare the person shit, that would still be genocide. Okay. Elements of the crime. The Genocide Convention establishes in Article 1 that the crime of genocide may take place in the context of armed conflict, international or non-international, but also in the context of peaceful situation. The latter is less common, but still possible. The same article establishes an obligation of contracting parties to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. The popular understanding of what constitutes genocide tends to be broader than the content of the norm under international law. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention contains a narrow definition of the crime of genocide, which includes two main elements. A mental element. Now, this is interesting. An intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and a physical element, which includes the 5 following acts enumerated exhaustively. Killing members of the group, causing serious body or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions on the conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The intent and the most difficult to determine to constitute genocide, there must be proven intent on the part of the perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Cultural destruction does not suffice. That it does say that. Good point. However, it's really ambiguous under the mental harm clause. Cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does any intention to simply disperse the group. So just moving people around doesn't count. it has special intent or dolus specialis that makes the crime of genocide so unique. In the case of international law, has associated intent with the existence of state or organizational plans of policy, even if the definition of genocide in international law does not include that element. That's the part that allows a get out clause for all this cultural stuff. Importantly, the victims of genocide are deliberately targeted, not randomly, because of their real or perceived membership of one of the four groups protected under convention, which excludes political groups, for example, but does include religious ones. This means that the target of destruction must be a group as such and not its members as individuals. Genocide can be committed only against part of the group as long as that part is identifiable, including within the geographically limited area, and substantial. So you don't have to actually literally kill people, but cultural destruction does not suffice. But mental destruction with intent to disperse the group does. I don't know about you, but I could point out all kinds of contradictions in that wording. And you also notice, yeah, national, racial, ethnical, or religious all count. Yet mental destruction that is aimed to physically destroy the group would count. I don't know exactly what that means, but that is what it's saying. But cultural elimination would not count. But if you're not, like, for example, if you're not killing people, but you're dispersing their children and breaking up their kinship groups, that does count. Because it is still, according to UN Charter, of physical destruction. So, like I said, a lot of stuff that we've done to build national polities, even if they weren't ethnic bloodbaths, are at least ambiguously implicated in this document. And you'll also note that if you constitute a group as a political group, but not an ethnical, how do you have a non-political national? Anyway, it doesn't count. Yeah, so killing communists wouldn't count, no. I bet you we know who made sure that was in there. Anyway. But killing all Yugoslavian communists would count because they're Yugoslavian, but not because they're communists. I'm just saying, even in this relatively narrow definition, there's a whole lot of fucking wriggle room. But for an example, is even if the residential schools were not extermination camps, they would count. Residential school programs in any place that does them would actually, if they're aimed at specific ethnic groups and not political groups. And again, I don't know how you have a national group that isn't a political, but anyway, but let's just stick with ethnic groups because it's kind of clearer. That would count as genocide, even if you weren't actively killing, the parents or the kids, because you are physically breaking up their ability to socially reproduce themselves. Ooh. Yeah, I mean, if you want to get into foreign policy stuff, and you also have to get into International Court of Justice case law and stuff like that. And I guess the clearest case of that, as Boskor is actually asking, is like the Serbian contentions. You can see how this gets really messy really fast. Yeah, cultural elimination could be bad and would be genocide. The question is, though, mental harm in any attempt to physically destroy the group, even if it doesn't include killing them, makes that cultural stuff kind of interesting, because cultural alone does not suffice. But if the cultural elimination is aimed to end the group physically existing, it would still count, I think, from reading the charter, but I'd have to go through International Court of Justice case law to really like figure it out. And like I'm not an international lawyer. I dropped out of law school. Got a poetry. They've got an MFA instead. Not because I like couldn't hack it, because I just hated it. Like, no, international law. I mean, no, international law also is what you can enforce as treaty law, and are the major powers, are the multipolar powers going to enforce it? We can see when they're not. I'm just saying. I mean, look, the rules-based international order was killed by the people who built the rules-based international order when it was inconvenient for them, and from 1998 to 2008. All right, let's actually be honest. From 1998 to 2021. Now they're like, oh my God, we've broken the rules and no one's playing by them anymore. We were only supposed to break them for ourselves. Oh no! That's what's going on right now. Would kulars count as a political group? Actually, this says nothing about class groups. Yeah, and the rules-based international order is also, it is like, we don't really need the UN. It's more like NATO rules. Like, let's be honest what that is, right? Like if you listen to the two political realists, there's the liberal-ish version, the Peter Zion version, and there's a conservative-ish version, the Mersheimer version. Zion wants a war with Russia, and Mersheimer wants war with China. Go pick your poison, I guess. Like, And this also does actually basically assume that any small power has no agency. What's the best Peter Zion book? I mean, they're all kind of good and terrible simultaneously. Like if you want to understand what the liberal end of neoconservatism will look like, what is Harris Cheney thought? I think you read Peter Zion. If you want to understand what more conservative aligned elements of neoconservatism are, I wouldn't say it's a neoconservative, but more conservative aligned versions of realism are, you would read Mersheimer. And so, and I mean, I often think there's like, the thing is with these, these geopolitical thinkers, they'll tell you way more of the truth than the politicians will. Yeah, Mersheimer says he doesn't want a hot war now, but he's also contradicted that not even that long ago, with talking about breaking Australia. Like people like here's the thing. Don't ever read these people without uncritically, right? They tell you a lot, but like their actual positive politics is usually pretty fucked up. So he went to China. Well, maybe that's all changing now. Who knows what Mersheimer wants? He's wanted a war for a long time. Maybe he's gotten over it. I don't know. Like, I think liberal international wonks want a Cold War with China, and some conservative international wonks are more okay with a hot war. They're both wars. It's just whether or not it's proxy or direct, and whether or not nukes are flying. Let's be quite honest. Oh, Mersheimer has always been more honest about what's going on in Israel, because he actually sees it as a weak point of empire, not a strength, that it's going to expose part of the whole dynamic. And also, Mersheimer thinks multipolarity is inevitable, and this is something I agree with him on. So like I don't talk about the good or bad of multipolarity, because like I said, it's like talking about the good or bad of rain. people think that I'm like saying that multipolarity is bad, and I'm like, no, it's just a thing. Like what we do in response to it is what matters, not that it exists. It exists. It's just recognizing the geopolitical reality at hand. Our concern as Marxists is more than just geopolitical reality. We have to figure out how we're going to orient to that change. There are people who just don't want to deal with it, who don't want to deal with the decline of American imperial and Bonapartist aspirations. And there's also people who think that the decline means that everything's going to fall apart tomorrow, and they've been predicting it for 10 to 15 years and it not happened. I hate to tell you this, but the ramp downs of this stuff is often slow. The British Empire started falling apart in 1890. It didn't completely fall apart until, I mean, arguably still hasn't completely fallen apart, but like mostly completely fallen apart until the end of World War II. I'd read anything by Zion and Mersheimer and read them against each other. Like try to like do this thing where like I always tell people, read these kind of books twice. Read it once to put yourself in the mindset of the person writing it so you can understand the way they think, and then the second time tear that shit apart. Like, you know, now I know I'm always telling people to do massive amounts of intellectual labor, and I know you can't all do that. I don't want to make it sound like I think that everybody should do nothing but fucking read. I actually don't think that's like the most important thing socialists do. But I do think like if you want to understand the way these fuckers think, you first have to try to put yourself in their mindset and see what their geopolitical priors are and understand them and understand their norms and values and what shit they're trying to sneak into. And then once you've done that, you go back and reread it to tear that shit apart from your own perspective. Yeah, you're right. Somebody on Twitch says, and the post World War II come apart of British Empire took what 20, 30 years. Yep. Arguably, it wasn't finished till Corbyn was done. I mean, Brexit is what completely kills it, because even the Britain ability to leverage its previous imperial status over the rest of continental Europe is over now. And we're just watching its economy become Argentina. Although Argentina has become something worse, so maybe I shouldn't use that comparison anymore. It's too fucking mean to Argentina. Anyway. No, the left doesn't want to understand the mindset of its enemies. This is one thing about the purity fetish stuff. They actually think, even though I don't like what they use it to defend another purity fetish. But like, that's actually right. Like, you have to understand the contradictions in your own society and your own social movements. Because, you know, even if we had the best there are contradictions. There are tensions within Marxism. If you don't think there are tensions between nationalism and internationalism, I don't know what you're on. Right? I can quote Marx against Marx because the way he works through the dialectical contradictions of national formations, hopefully leading to international formations and undoing the sense of nation states altogether. That is his goal. He thinks you have to operate nationally. And by nationally, we're not even talking about national polities exactly. We're not just talking about the Westphalian system. We're also talking about people who share your language, because it's easier to organize with people who speak the same fucking language as you. A purity fetish to hold another purity. I actually call that a stalled sublation, which is the most Hegelian fucking shit you can call it ever. But it's when the unhappy consciousness that leads you to look at the contradiction can't face the contradiction. And so instead of trying to go through the antagonism and come out, you know, in the new third thing, you get stuck trying to defend one element of it or the other by over attaching to some prior pole in that contradictory sphere. And look, that's a big fucking ask. And a lot of people just look at that when I tell that stuff in dialectical terms and just tell, well, that's nonsense anyway. And like, you know, I don't know what to do with that, but yeah. Well, I mean, here's the thing. There's two problems. All right. We hear a lot the left isn't oriented to take power, let alone gain power. But also, a lot of the left that is oriented to take power doesn't fucking know what they're going to do when they take power. They don't have a programmatic minimum vision for what they do with power anyway, other than have it for someone else, maybe. You know, like actually, when we say that, we're only looking at one part of the stalled dialectic. You're right. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it's only part of it. Socialism in one country. I love that because in a way, what we see is like we figured out socialism in one country, but we also have to admit that China had to link up with international capitalism to get its internal development possible because it couldn't do it alone, thus having to abandon its collected period because that was stalled out because the autarkic visions of that version of industrial development were impossible. But yet, we think socialism in one country is totally viable forever. Like even the people who thought socialism in one culture was, I've read Stalin, I've read the books on Stalin. I tell people if you want to understand, both like you want to understand Stalin in a context, you read the work of Eric Van Ree, who I don't think I think he was a Marxist-Leninist. I don't think he is anymore. I'm not even sure he's a Marxist anymore, but he actually does work through these like debates and contradictions and actually cites like in the socialism in one country versus the international socialism debate, that Marx was clearly on the international side, although he did think national revolutions were necessary. Whereas the socialism in one country people and the international people had quotes from Lenin to back themselves up, and they were ignoring the contradictory quotes and constructing their version of Lenin. And he actually, even when he was a Marxist-Leninist, he admitted that like all sides of that debate between the center, the right opposition, and the left opposition, not just Trotsky versus Stalin, because that's a very simplistic way to view this. All sides had Lenin theoretically to back them up. So it's and there's more positions than just universal revolution everywhere all at once are socialism in one country. There is socialism in one country as a remnant that is possible and to maintain itself until the international revolution happens. There's socialism in one country as a coherent internal concept. There's socialism in one country as that is possible for a while, but after a while will revert to capitalism, which, by the way, in Russia is what happened. So, that whole debate, we simplify it to make it like a good versus evil single side thing and pick your side. But the people who do that do not understand. They haven't really gone through the debates in the international congresses, or they've cherry picked them. It is what it is. Why do you think that there's so much focus on Lacerda and Western Marxism at the moment? Is it related to the recrudescence of Stalinism with the Zoomers? Well, the thing is, I think it's related to the fact, honestly, the fact that the social democratic movement so thoroughly failed. And also seemed to do what I was warning people that it might do. And I was warning people as early as 2018. That it might actually revitalize the center, because we've seen the far right do that to the center right too. All right. I'm not just basing that off of like some like comparison to what the Social Democrats did to the Weimar Republic or whatever. I'm also basing it off of like what modal and far left or far right oriented movements had done in relationship to the center recently. So, there we go. I think that tardiness now is also related to the impetus of the left in regards to genocide now by Zion Israel. Well, absolutely. But the thing is, like, you have to ask yourself, why aren't any of the other major powers doing a whole lot? Like, there are major powers now who could blockade Israel who are not, and who are not tied into the West. Ask yourself why that's happening. We're absolutely right to focus on the Western involvement, and the main suppliers of Israeli weapons of the U.S. was Germany. I think there might be a curtailing of that, but it definitely was Germany until relatively recently. And it was like 60% from the U.S. and 30% from Germany, and like 10% from other nations in the EU. But there's other dynamics going on there. And there's other geopolitical dynamics going on there. And there's both the difference between the way people orient towards their internal populations and what they say internally versus what they say externally. And I hate to tell you, but everybody needs to be more cynical on that, because if someone there are other powers who can embargo Israel who aren't, and they may not be doing it because the U.S. is stopping them. I'm not even I don't know why they aren't. Right? But it's something you have to look at, which means that these solidarity movements are important because you got to pull on the levers that you have. But it also, what levers do you fucking have? And everyone just assumes no one's going to allow us to watch barbarism happen, but we might. I don't want to live in that world, but I don't necessarily have a choice if I live in that world either. Yeah, exactly. Turkey, exactly. I could talk about the fact that Turkey was talking all this embargo stuff, but still sending sheet steel to Israel till relatively recently. And when they stopped sending it to Israel, where are they sending it to the Palestinian Authority? Where that is that sheet steel probably ending up? I don't know, but I got my guesses. Where do we have the leverage? Well, here's the thing. International politics is the part of politics that you have the least leverage on after World War II. In theory, even in bourgeois congressional forms, you are supposed to. Did the Soviet Union ever? That's a complicated question. I'll get back to that, because the Soviet Union's relationship to capitalism is really weird. In that the internal to the Soviet Union itself, they really didn't have a trade system that was just capitalistic, that allowed for the private valorization of profits in that way. But on the international stage, they did act as a capitalist and were subject to capitalist discipline through loans. So it's a little bit that's actually a much more complicated question than I think people realize. But why would Turkey oppose genocide of a colonized population when doing so would also open it up to the accusations of hypocrisy in regards to Kurds and Armenians? Well, why are we doubling down on nationalism in the moment that we all know that climate change is going to force the great migration of peoples, and it already is? That is not a hypothetical in the future situation. That is now. Well, we all hope that people discover their power into fighting international oppositions, but I hate to tell you that student protest movements, while they're often morally right, however, I'm going to put an asterisk on that, because we tend to think all the student baby boomers were anti-war. No, they fucking weren't. The students were actually late to the game. Lacerda's critiques of 20th century Lexington lecture lumps the Frankfurt School in with Agamben and Zizek as complicit with imperialism. Yeah, he also does that with Badiou in some ways, and he also includes non-Marxist in that when talking about Western Marxism, and then he doesn't include a lot of. There are people more complicit than the people he mentions. He doesn't talk about Norman Brown. Not Norman Brown. Norman Brown, the head of the Socialist Party of America in the 50s. I think it was Norman Brown, but it's different from Norman O. Brown. So it's all way more complicated. I'm not even saying those Lacerda and Rockhill are wrong. There's some. I think the Frankfurt School is a wildly weird formation. But I don't think it was all. I don't think you can simplify it to Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas. Norman Thomas, thank you, not Norman Brown. I'm getting old, and names are getting more and more conflated in my head. Norman's sort of doesn't make sense, but why are people interested in it? Well, because they want to explain why they lost, dude. They want to explain why they lost, and they want to explain why their tradition doesn't seem to give them any way to handle it. It's like when you read Vincent Bevins' book, "If We Burn" or whatever. I have it over here somewhere. Is not a bad book, right? But it talks about it as if all these groups were just like solely the kind of college activists that led them out, as opposed to like large groups of informal workers who actually just teamed up with college activists because they had the resources. So, you know, I mean, I don't want to, I don't, here's the thing, guys. I don't want to excuse all of the Frankfurt School for some of the stuff that they're accused of. Like, I think Horkheimer's position on the Vietnam War was fucking nuts. And I do think there are weird relationships with the intelligence agencies and Marxist intellectuals, even with people like Fanon. Like, it is not clean. I'm not saying this to like Fed stitch Fanon, but Fanon had a Fed handler. They knew about each other. Like, there was interactions there. People need to read more Fanon and more Marx if they're going to read. I mean, like, fuck, man. You make it sound like all I want you guys to do is read, and I actually think there's more to life to that. But if you have the capacity to read, particularly in a world where a lot of people now read at a fourth grade level and do not have the capacity to understand these texts, you have a moral responsibility to represent them accurately, as best as you can, and as fairly as you can, even if you are critical of them. And the other thing I'm going to say is that people can go through theorists that I don't necessarily love and come out in good positions and good politics anyway. Right? Like there are people, you know, there are people that you have to there are people that you have to kind of deal with in this way, and I don't think a lot of people really want to do that. Or we do it selectively because it's, I mean, like, looking at the interrelations of all these groups and who did what to whom and how much intelligence agencies are involved, and it's an ugly history. Like, there's not a movement of communists in the United States in the 60s and 70s that wasn't full of fucking feds, including ones aligned to the Soviet Union or communist China explicitly, and we know this from declassified documents. I mean, you know, this is like when the right wingers will talk about like Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies and how the international elites were using the Jews to save capitalism by installing communism. Yeah, they say shit like that. And one thing they say that is true is that the Kaiser Reich really did help send Lenin back to fuck up Russia. What's Burgess? I don't know what Burgess do for now. He's an analytical Marxist. You know, like, I also don't really agree with his reading of Marx all the time either, but I don't get super butthurt. But I don't tell anyone to read less of X and more of X as if that kind of slogan's going to mean anything. Yeah, the steel train carriage, absolutely correct. And you better believe right-wing conspiracy theorists make a heyday out of that shit. But it's true. That really happened. Look, I'm not here to tell. What I'm telling you guys is anti-immigration sentiments happen when there's competition and people view, rightly or wrongly, ethnic groups as akin to kinship groups. And like with Haitians, that's probably even somewhat true, but in the broader sense of like white, black versus Latino, that's not true at all. And yes, right wingers promote this, absolutely. I also think it's a conservatizing element in groups under stress. Even oppressed groups do it. Like, think about how the Manx and the Irish went from being off-white to real white because they weren't WASP and they weren't fully considered part of the club. And it was using racial tensions and people like Carnegie bringing in black workers from the South who were desperate to break Manx, Cornish, and Irish strikers, which made them identify with white people. Absolutely fucking true. And then when the black people started demanding the rights that the white people were demanding, what did they do? These same people who were being woke up until that point, and whatever the capitalist 1910s version of woke was, to use a colloquial word that has been abused to almost having no meaning, they fucking supported, anti-black movements to make sure that that black workers would stay a cheap workforce. Of course they fucking did that. Like, if anyone studies that, but also you have to like deal with the fact that that's not all from the outside. People view other people as potential threats. You have to deal with human tribalism and internationalism. And no, it's not just middle class white people. I mean, like, the stats bear that out. Like, the desire to not be white has white people doing colorism on other white people. I mean, yeah, but that's always true. That's always been true. When I was growing up, because I grew up in the black side of the neighborhood, I have an ethnically ambiguous family, and I have relatives who are Korean and relatives who are black, right? Not close relatives, but people used to call me zebra. That was in the 80s. The policing of white identity is also like, it's like this weird cancerous metabolism that's always growing and constricting as what is politically necessary for it to do. Liberals aren't wrong about that. Like, you know, um, that's true for a lot of these formations of trans ethnic identities or even ethnic identities. Like, civic nationalism and organic nationalism developed simultaneously. And yet there are tensions between that. Like, if you think you're going to go to like real workers movements and it's just going to be like both the people who say, oh, workers would never be racist, and people who like are jingoist chauvinists, they have natural contingencies within the working class. They both do. Just like people say, oh, that's only PMC. You don't meet any working class people. Oh, well, baristas are like that. Well, baristas aren't working class. See, you're changing the definition of the relationship of productivity and what productivity means there, because baristas actually, even more than other services, make a commodity called coffee that they make on the spot for you. The fact that you consume it instantly doesn't mean it's not a commodity that isn't traded on the market in abstract. Like, and what that's doing is like, oh, you're having to redefine a analytic category to meet your cultural needs so that you can maintain a. I always talk about the difference between the in itself and the for itself, but also the difference between the collective imaginary and the real aggregate. And the collective imaginary is not necessarily the for itself. The for itself is classes organized for a political purpose that can also include people who are not actually from that class background, who see their interest in that class future, right? That is a class politics for itself. But the political imaginary, or the collective imaginary, is what we imagine that collective to be. And those are not the same thing, nor are neither one of them are the class in itself, are just a sociological reality of the class. Now, people will try to use this to say we don't even have to worry about the class in itself, which I think it's crazy. So, like, by workers, we mean this platonic form that doesn't exist that would do what we wanted it to do, which I think is absurd. But we do have to realize that just being an aggregate analytic sociological category is not the same as having a clear, coherent political vision. In your interview with Nathan Bollengren, he mentions the Cold War sci-fi novel Swan Song by Robert McKinnon. Really interesting book so far. Curious if you've read it. I have read it. I've read a lot of those like Cold War, Into the World / sci-fi novels. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with them. Actually, it's one of the things I do. Like, even before I was a Marxist, I was obsessed with them. So I've never seen the anti-barista people say waiters and cooks aren't working class. It is interesting, and I have seen them say petit bourgeois people are working class, which is bizarre. But yeah. Yeah, I know. Although it's funny because I know church ladies with blue hair now. Like, you can go to the LDS church and there's like fucking like people who are in like sexy modest dress who have blue hair. Who fucking cares? What I mean, look, platypus is so vision. All right, I should be very careful. I'm tired of people baiting me into talking about platypus when I left that goddamn organization over a decade ago. But platypus's vision for what it's doing is to put the left in dialogue to itself so the left can see itself and transcend its problems. That's one of the things they intend to do. So they throw every left that they can get to put in dialogue with every other leftist on the idea that the tension that will bring up would start to lead people through some other venture outside of politics. My response to that has always been, well, if that worked, you guys would have succeeded by now, but you've been doing it since 2000 and I don't know 7, and I don't really know how that's changed the broader left, except, in ways that you actually feel further away from what you want. Who actually says baristas aren't workers except for that roid rage infrared guy? Well, I mean, the ACP goes into that and people downstream of that. Also, there are some productivists who really do think that aren't just infrared. But, well, Nikki's statement is bizarre. I mean, like, Nikki talks about physiognomy and phrenology and shit. Like, it's yeah, we used to refer to blue hairs as like gray haired people in church, and now we refer to them as the fact that like punk fashion is now totally acceptable in the LDS. Yes, I do. like I don't know. I mean, I tend to think Chris Catrone actually is often right about the flaws of the left. I disagree with him on other things. But I mean, I get tired of talking about that. There are groups that I think are way more symptomatic of the current situation. The reason why you guys bring it up is I A used to be a member and B that I used to work for Doug Lane, right? Like, let's be honest about why you guys ask me about this shit all the time. And a lot of you know me from one of those two ventures, right? But like, I don't have any hostility to them. I don't necessarily agree with them. I definitely don't agree with some stances they've taken on Palestine. I don't even understand all the stances that they've taken on Palestine, if I'll be quite honest with you. Um, I when they told me in 2016 when they were first doing the project for a new socialist party, I was like, cool, they're doing it again. We'll see if it goes anywhere this time. Who knows? I was my work with Doug is actually complicated. Doug was not my employer. Um, Doug did not own Zero Books. Doug was the publisher, which means effectively he was the manager of Zero Books, but he could fire me. even though he didn't sign my paycheck. So yeah, he didn't fire me. I left, but nonetheless, I don't have any hostility to him. I don't agree with him a lot of the time, but and I get frustrated and say, I am just as given to say outlandish bullshit as anyone else in this goddamn world. But um, uh, I find this obsession with people's media relationships really kind of weird. I used to think that way about the great Sam Seder versus Jimmy Dore debates and shit. They were right about different things and they were wrong about different things, and neither one of them have changed their politics. Dore's politics have changed more than Seder's, but Seder's an Air America man, and he'll probably die an Air America man. That's not my politics, never was, but I also knew what he was. I find the anti-deport, anti-culture war folks oddly complaining about blue-hair people, despite it being a culture war sentiment rooted in conservative traditional workers. Right. Well, here's the thing. How many, the idea that there aren't working class lesbians at gas stations and baristas is just weird to me. I fucking know those people. They're down the road. It's just a strange, it's like they want a 1940s 1950s Fordist era industrial proletariat to exist, and cannot accept that even if they reindustrialize the way I didn't get into the three forms of deindustrialization. I'll come back to that in a second. I've been talking around it. But even if they got what they wanted, it wouldn't look like what they think it would look like, because the organic composition needs of industrial production do not require that kind of mass employment anymore. So this becomes a projection of what a politics should be. And this obsession with entrepreneurialism and stuff about that shit to me is I've seen that before, and it was in Werner Sombart. So if you don't know who that is, you should. Werner Sombart was a member of the German historical school who was also a Marxist, who ended up going down this productivist thing and combining Weber and Marx in a way that led him to valorize the entrepreneurial period of capitalism versus the corporate period of capitalism, and he blamed both on the Jews. And then he died a Nazi. So, yeah. What do you think about the lack of industrialism in the sense it hinged Marxist revolutionary theory on? Here's the thing you have to deal with. Marx in Das Kapital has a couple of contradictory statements. And I don't mean contradictory here as in he's contradicting himself. But he actually, in that book, not in some other things he writes, like his stuff in his battles with the anarchists, he actually acts like centralization is going to happen forever. But in Das Kapital, it's actually clear that there are countervailing tendencies in capital that cause it to break apart and reconstitute and break apart and reconstitute all the time. And so there is already hints of deindustrialization and increased financialization in Capital Volume 2 and 3. So, we have to look at that for what it is. There's all kinds of problems. If you read Capital Volume 1, the immiseration thesis is part of chapter 25, I think. But then there's other things in capital that seem to work out if you follow logic. They don't exactly work out that way. These are testable empirical claims too, and people kind of want to make them not, because no one ever wants to say. I actually kind of admired back in the 50s and 60s when Marxist Leninists would say they were fundamentally altering things in Marx because the social history has changed. Baron Sweezy did that with monopoly capital theory. Their monopoly capital theory is often presented as being the same as Lenin's and Bukharin's. It's kind of not, actually. It's very much instigated in Fordist organizational terms, whereas the The Lenin version was more based on what the beginnings of development of government corporations and the return of like mercantilist policies. That's what they're really observing. But there is a way in which they're related theories. I don't want to say that like Barrow and Sweezy were like stealing Bauer by associating with Lenin. They were developing it in a different way. I don't agree with it, but I mean, I don't think it's out of nowhere. But anyway, my point on that being that a lot of people have tried to explain this and just admit that, like, well, some parts of Marx probably worked and some parts didn't. Today, we often have this weird, like, Marx didn't really mean it mentality by going to a few texts that somehow abrogate all the other text. Usually, it's the letters to Vera Zasulik, and it's like one fragment of the Grundrisse, and maybe the footnotes on Liebig, you know. So yeah. There is a way in which finance capital discussions were actually a big part of Marxist Leninism. So the whole finance thing, that's pretty common to like people like Werner Sombart. But there was a time, for example, I believe in one of the congresses in the mid 30s, where the Comintern decided that like fascism was financial capitalism. But then later on, there are other statements by the Comintern that are not copacetic with that thesis. You make your sense. People like to read the Comintern documents as like, oh, they decided this and they stepped with it forever when they actively did not. And you got to remember, these people were theorizing in real time in response to real events, and often also to justify their own fucking policies. So like, I don't think you can just go to like one era of the Comintern like, well, this is the answer, because you just can't really do that. But yeah, Sato does that. I mean, I've been waiting for Sato. Sato keeps saying there's this big treasure trove of stuff in the mega notes that like validates his stuff. But whenever I read him, it's like the same stuff that the New Left did. It's like the Sasuik letters and maybe the ethnological notebooks, and like, I'm just like, can't we? I mean, I don't even disagree with Sato's first book entirely, but like when he's trying to argue that like capital is really just about the environment, and I'm like, I mean, it's in there, but and yes, if you follow Marxist logic through, capitalism will exhaust all environmental resources. That is an implication in Das Kapital, but that's not the only thing or the primary thing it's about. Yeah, and even, but yes, you're right. The people pitting financial capitalists against producers, that's imminent in bourgeois politics. That was common in John Adams and Andrew Jackson. Like that was a common thread in bourgeois politics way before Marx. You know, I need to read more. I've read more about the Stalin era and the Khrushchev era and perestroika, because I can get books that were like, it's easy to get books that were even contemporary to perestroika, right? Like you can just find them. I actually don't know as much as I should about the internal workings. I know a little bit about the economic and technological development history of the Soviet Union during Brezhnev to whatever Shinko to Andropov, but I don't know it well enough internally to the Soviet Union itself, and I need to work on that. I wish I could like give you more recommendations on that, but it's not my strong suit, and I know it, and I need to fix it. If you guys have reading recommendations, I'd love to hear them. So Triumph of Broken Promises, I'm going to add that to my gonna get this book from the library. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, massive overcorrection is common to. It's not just common to Marxists; it's common to all ideological tendencies, right? Like this is a human thing. Maybe you can even see it as part of systemic or dialectical reasoning, right? But I get tired of the pendulum swinging wildly back and forth and never like coming to the third thing. Korostani, I was just looking. I was just looking at a book that's underread by Korostani because Daniel Tutt told me to read it, and I need to read it. But you guys know how much shit I have on my plate to read. It's pretty like, uh, yeah. I have Vanessa Will's book, and I'm going to start it. I might ask her to come on the show. I want to get that Marxist Republicanism book. I'm trying to get people to give me translations of stuff out of Francois Bode. I think it's weird that we don't have translations of Mélenchon's work into English. Yeah. I also feel woefully underprepared to understand Yugoslav political economy. I didn't say the name. What's the name he told me to look? It was like Karastani. Hold on. I'm gonna just pull it up. Let me look it up in my drive. And the book in question was Trans Critique on Kant and on Kant and Marx. I need to. Well, does the new translation have Heinrich's explicit footnote? Let me see. I actually have it. Let me see. I will admit that I haven't gone through and compared this to my Mandel edited version, the old one. I had not read Enrique Dussel either. So yeah. Do you work to go hard on the old classic text before jumping on contemporary debates? I think it depends on the debate. So yeah, no, Fitzpatrick is good on. Fitzpatrick and Geddes are good on like the 20s and 30s and 40s. They're not. I don't know that they write very much about the later periods. You know who you should ask about that? The Eurasian Knot podcaster guy, Sean Guillory. I'm sure he could give you resources. He would at least know the specialists in the field, and even if they're liberals. I often go to him for book suggestions. I'm not gonna lie. I've gotten really fascinated in like the cultural critique in the Soviet Union around perestroika, where all these like apparatchik engineers started identifying with Russian aristocracy, even though their grandparents were fucking peasants. I've really become fascinated with that to try to understand, because you always hear that like, oh, Americans think they're temporary embarrassed millionaires, but no one else thinks that. And actually, no, we're not the only people who do that shit. And I really want to understand it as a tendency, because we have to understand it to really. Yeah, I have the Kotkin book about the collapse, but that's more about perestroika. 1970. I have that Kotkin book on that. I think it's on my Kindle. And I think I perused it, but it's been so long, I didn't read it very deeply. I went through this period about 10 years ago where I was reading any bit of Soviet historiography I could get my hands on, but I was reading it very quickly and not like very 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 rigorously when I was doing that. Because there's just a lot of stuff I'm like, I read that book but I don't remember shit about it. And that's just an indication that I was reading too quickly and too superficially, so I need to go back and revisit a lot of that stuff. And also, like, I have a much more adept view of Marxism now than I did when I was reading a lot of that stuff, and I need to go back. I also read a lot of books on Chinese history. I'm really fascinated with I know I sound critical sometimes of the PRC, but I'm actually very fascinated with Chinese theories and Chinese history and the internal Chinese debates. And I actually get very frustrated when we pretend that like the debates around Maoism were only in the West, that they weren't in China itself. Like one of the things that Carlos Garrido asserts, and he just asserts it, is like capitalist rotor was a Western Marxist invention. And I'm like, that was definitely an accusation within the Chinese Communist Party in the 60s. Absolutely was. That is not an outside innovation. All right. You guys are like stump Varn with books, and I'm beginning to get stumped. So I need to read the Vladislav Sobuk book, the Collapse book. I think I have the Kremlin Cold War book from Stalin and Khrushchev, but I don't think I've read the Collapse book. It's a Collapse book again. Is that about the Brezhnev era or about Perestroika? That's like a different book. And I he's got a Cold War book that I really want to read, but it's not out yet. I think it'll come out next year, maybe. I just said I don't want to talk about that shit. I don't have strong thoughts in it. I think it's weird that you'd attach it to that you'd attach a political movement to a pay app, but and the thing is, they've like the campaign for a socialist party is not new. It also happened, and Catron did it in 2016, and it didn't go anywhere. I don't know why it didn't go anywhere. I actually like kind of followed it then, but what I've heard is that people just couldn't get along with Platypus, and while there's there's this idea that Platypus wants a multi-tendency American Socialist Party, that also that they're very hard to get along with other people. So I don't know. I don't have strong thoughts on it. I don't want to like condemn something that I'm not intimately aware of, but I do know that this is not the first time that they've tried that. And also, they're not the only person trying to revive a socialist party in America. There's like at least two other groups trying to start a new SPA. Now that the SPUSA seems to be stalled out. Does anyone know what happened with the SPUSA after Mimi Sobchak died? Like where are they? What happened to them? I was almost a member in like 2010, 2011. So there was no local chapter for me where Jenna went abroad in 2010. So I didn't ever. I was like a fellow traveler at large, and then got really frustrated. But does anyone know what happened to them? I don't know what happened to them. Are they still around even? Like, there's so many socialist groups, guys, that I feel like just disappeared. I don't know. Like, what's happened to the WWP? Is the World Workers Party still around? Are they doing anything now that Maupin's not their leader? Like, what's going on? Anyway, let me see. I was looking here to see if I could find the Kleiman footnotes. I'm not Kleiman. Heinrich footnotes. That's a fuck up. Those two people don't get along. Maybe they're not labeled. Let me see here. Let me look at the front matter. There's a foreword by Wendy Brown, which I find weird. I believe there are some notations by the editors, but the editors are Paul North and Paul Reiter. Kleiman is on the editorial board of this book, but I don't think he did the footnotes, no. This is WWP is still around, but mostly clustered in the Northeast now. Okay. It's kind of like the RCP Maoist is still around, you know, the Avacanites, but they're kind of clustered in New York and Berkeley. Anarchations, well, you know, stop clocks and all. The SPU is around, but it's very limited. I mean, you know, yeah. Do I have a favorite work of fiction from the 20th century? Yes, it's Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, and I've read it like 100 times. I also like the Buddha's Little Finger by Victor Pelikan. Pelikan is a Russian author. I have a boner for Soviet and post-Soviet literature, actually. So yeah, every org exists in New York and Berkeley. Or Chicago. Chicago's got a lot of socialist orgs. Are there any interesting currents in anthropology? I've been reading a lot of Marshall Solins, but I've also been like getting into the work of Chris Knight. I had him on the show. That'll come out in December or maybe early January because I record really far ahead. And I oh, if Megalopolis was inspired by David Graeber, never mind. But anyway, I think Chris Knight's interesting because he doesn't throw out the biological entirely, but he also socially contextualizes it. Marshall Solins is pretty good, but early Solins is better than late Solins because Marshall Solins does throw out the biological. That's just Chicago and the socialist orgs. Are you Limenovs or Limonov? I haven't read much of that work now. I like Kafka. This is the wild Q&A period of the live stream that I only do once a month. Yeah, we're gonna read on Kings. If you are a Varn patron, I don't normally plug my patron because I don't think it's really necessary. But we are doing a theory workshop, and we are going through. I believe we are going to do the Brenner debates book. Then we are going to do the political thought of Joseph Stalin by Eric Van Ree, and then we are going to do On Kings by Graeber and Solins, even though like I don't like I'm kind of at war with David Graeber. Like I'm writing a book that like the first like 50 pages is going to be on Bordiga, and I'm afraid that the rest of the book is just me ranting about Mark Fisher and David Graeber. And Mark Fisher, I'm ambivalent, but like kind of pro, and David Graeber, I'm ambivalent, but more definitely anti. But yeah. Can you recommend anything on the idea that the New Testament was a document of political revolution? Michael Hudson has like Us Forgive Our Debts, and I know Graeber has some work. My problem with Hudson's book is he takes the literary evidence from the Bible literally, and it does not backed up by the archaeological evidence. We don't know that anyone ever actually used Deuteronomy as a legal code. But I would tell you to read. Who would I say to read on that? Maybe Roland Bohr a little bit. Oh, there's not particularly about that. Yeah. Debt Jubilee. Ooh, boy. It is convenient to be at war with a dead man. Yes, I know. I've already won. No, actually, it's harder to kill a dead man's ideas. It was a lot easier to fight with Graeber when he was still alive. Because I did, by the way. Like, we got into massive fights about the political economy of China in the 15th century on my blog, and he called me an incoherent Marxist, and I called him a transhistorical goober, who didn't believe in biology, and also labeled things capitalist or communism based on vibes. That's kind. I mean, I didn't use those terms at the time, but that's more or less what I meant. Leviticus was the real book of laws, probably yes. Although even that we don't know how much it was actually enforced. Roland Bohr, that is how you spell that. You spelled it correctly. That is Rolandbore. He is, I think he works in China now, but he's an Australian dude. who writes mostly on religion, and he has a weird book on like the political radicalism of John Calvin. Um, uh, yeah, I think I would love to believe that Kotsky's Foundations of Christianity was true, but it's kind of projections. I had the guy Miles and who is the guy? Not Jason Miles. I'm one of the people who published this book. It's one of the two last books I published at Jesus, a Life in Class by James Crossley and Miles. Fuck, he was on my show. God damn it. And Robert Miles, excuse me, Robert Miles. And Jesus, a Life in Class Conflict is a book that I would suggest people read. When I left Zero, the last two books that I pushed through was that book by Crossley and Miles, and Doug Ena Green's book on Harrington, which I have right here. In fact, A Failure of Vision was, I think I suggested the title. So I'll claim that. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure I suggested the title. And it's a good biography of Harrington. You should read it. And not just because I helped publish it. It was rejected by Haymarket, and a friend of my mutual friend of mine that I work with, I won't name her because she doesn't want me to name her, sent me this manuscript, and I really fought to get it published because I think we need to understand and critique Harrington deeper than we often have. All right. Ever read Personal Everett's novels? I feel like I may have. Let me look that up. Good book on Confucianism, Marxist that isn't a Maoist diatribe or a post-Dengist Chinese net. I don't actually know that book. I've mostly read about the relationship to Confucianism as manifested in the Cultural Revolution, and then tried to figure out what the hell went on with like the rehabilitation of Confucianism and Chinese national thought post 1980s. But I don't have a good book on it. I have a friend of mine who's a sinologist. I'll ask him. See if I can get that from you. What by Personal Everett? I feel like I have. Guys, I read a ton, and I read too quickly sometimes, and I don't always remember what I read, at least not by author name. Let me see. Percival Everett. What have I read or not read? James, Erasure, Trees, Telephone, Dr. No. I think I've read Dr. No. Obviously, he didn't leave that much of an impression on me since I don't remember it. But I haven't read a lot of these books. I must have read. Oh yeah, I remember when I was doing my coursework on African American literature. I read Dr. No. In the same class that I read like a bunch of Toni Morrison and a bunch of Ismail Reed and the Fragments of Juneteenth by Ralph Ellison and a bunch of that stuff. Any alternative fictions with the Sino-Soviet split didn't happen? I don't know. I'd love to read it because I'd like to see, like, for me, like the Sino-Soviet split is like the second original sin. The first one is like the German Revolution going tits up in 1918, and the next one is the Sino-Soviet split, and I blame that on everybody. Do you think the Suman infatuation with Stalinism, asterisk Marxist-Leninism, actually existing socialism is anything like a counter-identification with millennial horizonalism and post-structuralism? Duh. It's an overcorrection, just like that was an overcorrection. Were you sad about Frederick Jameson? A little bit. A little bit. Frederick Jameson was one of the first Marxist academics I read before I was a Marxist. American fiction. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was sad about Jameson a little bit. But, I don't know. Jameson's doesn't have the same kind of meaning to me that like Mike Davis has are yeah. So I was sadder about Matt Davis dying, but I kind of feel like we're losing a lot of those like new left luminaries, and we're not replacing them with much. And so I worry about that. But it's not like Jameson was young. Yeah, Erasure is the novel in which America. Yeah, you know what, you guys, I'm going to add that to my reading list. We're going to read a bunch of Percival Everett, and I'll get back to you. Um, Look, I'm very Rodrigo Nunes on like neither horizontalism or horizonalism. I always pronounce it wrong. I always drop the T. People get really pissy about it. I don't know why, because it's just a dialect thing. Um, Horizonalism and horizontalism are like, horizontalism is not a word, it's just a dialectical pronunciation. So I figure that's understandable, but a lot of people get pissy about it. Verticalism, I don't think either one of them work by themselves. Jason Moore, Jason Moore, the communization guy, he wrote this. I've been reading this long thing he wrote on population by on the Brooklyn Rail, I think. If we're thinking about the right Jason Moore, like communists with normal names, kind of, are sometimes hard for me to remember which one I've read, like which Jason Moore and which Jason Smith. And I feel like every fucking person born between 70 and 80 and 85 had the fucking name Jason. But yeah. Verizonalism, very terrible. Verizon. So read James, Chris Olsen. All right, well, that's what I'll start. Well, here's the thing, though. I mean, Zoomer Stalinism and Melism is different and has the potential to stick around, but it has no social base outside of alienated people. So I don't think so. I mean, I think it's going to go the same way. Some of it's going to stick around because it's around, because some of it stuck around from the New Communist movement in the 70s. But yeah, what do you think about that Marxist translator that became a pragmatist that Phil Neal brought up? You mean Sidney Hook? Which one? One of the weirdest bits of history I'm really fascinated about, that Emmett Till's dad was in the same prison in Pizan, Italy, as Ezra Pound. That is such a bizarre thing, and I think Ezra Pound even mentions him once in the Pizan cantos. It's bizarre to think about that. Like, talk about weird coalitions of bizarre areas of history and the arts and American trauma and all that shit. Like, I have, like, there's a poetry book about that now. I can't remember who wrote it. I do remember liking it. Do we have new Mike Davises and Frederick James? No. No, I don't. I feel like theoretically right now we're kind of in a nadir. I mean, one of the things about it is like very few Mélenchon does theory, and Lenin did theory, and Stalin did theory. But I feel like a lot of the reason the Anglophone left is kind of in a weird place is because our politicians don't do theoretical work. I mean, what was Bernie before he was a career politician? Basically a kind of mad journalist. Why don't we have a new Frank David Davis game? We don't have the same social reproduction routes. There are not routes into the academy in the same way. The humanities, where a lot of these people were hiding for so long through Long March to the academy, is like that in general is dying, even the liberal end of it, not just the Marxist end. It's harder to get people to read. There's less strategic and I think yes, I think Pound was one of the first. I don't think he was one of the first people to use it. I think he was one of the first people to use it for a political crime of treason, though. But I don't know. But yes, he did get off on the insanity defense, which is kind of wild to me. But no use theories because of access to higher education and subsumption. I mean, you know, look, you guys keep asking me to write a theoretical book, and I take 4 years to do it, and then maybe not finish it. It's hard to do. Particularly me. I'd much rather write poetry. Like, I'm not gonna lie. But apparently some of you want me to actually put my thoughts down on fucking paper. So there we go. So there is a book. I'm gonna have probably it done in the next year, I hope. I was hoping to get more of it done during the summer, but I got married a month ago. I've been in the hospital a lot. I know I don't talk about that. And a lot of my family died. So I've had other things on my mind. When you thought when a thought should be a poem, when it sounds good. And I don't think poetry is a place to do didactic work. I don't try to write my poetry is political because you can't escape the political as a person operating in a social context. But yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing you can get I don't think these Marxist-Leninist assumers are wrong to think that the millennial left really saved the Democratic Party from its what should have been its comeuppance after Obama didn't do shit. Good fiction I've read lately. What have I read that's fictional lately? When I read for fun these days, it's either poetry or it's horror fiction. I'm really into horror fiction. And what have I read that was horror fiction lately? I really liked a book by Stephen Graham Jones. Let me look at what it was. I gotta look at my Kindle list because I read fiction on Kindle. I if I'm not doing theoretical notes on it, I've read Ligotti. I like Ligotti if you like being depressed. Oh, you know what? I actually did like. This is going to sound really hokey, but the You Like It Darker short story book by Stephen King is actually pretty good. But what's the Stephen Graham Jones book I read recently? Let me look that up. All right. This one's not new. It's from 2016, but it's Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. I really like that book. Didactic poetry is usually off-putting because it tries to dictate part of what poetry I think is about is the way that language requires you to finish it, and so it is a mutually created thing. When you try to use poetry in a didactic manner beyond just memorizing slogans and whatnot, what it often ends up doing is it feels like you're trying to be told what to think. I like Brian Evanson's books a lot. I have all of them. Underrated fiction writers. Let me think. Who wrote Appointment in Samara? I think the book is a mid-century book that's really underrated. John O'Hara, I think. Yeah, it is John O'Hara. That book is underrated. What do you think about Captain Beefheart? I used to listen to Captain Beefheart all the time when I was in college because all the hip people were doing it. I haven't listened to it in 10 years. Yeah, John O'Hara. Thank you. I like John O'Hara a lot. And I like King's short stories and do not like his novels. I like Junji Ito a lot, although I haven't read his most recently translated stuff. But I have Uzumaki and Frankenstein and a lot of those books over there. It's over there where I also keep my Berserk collection. Yeah. So yeah, just I don't. Oh, I different John O'Hara, but I like the lunch poems a lot. Yes. Do you have any guilty pleasures? But half my favorite fiction is coded right wing. A lot of my favorite poets are coded right wing. Like I really kind of like Wallace Stevens and Ezra Pound. My uh who would I think is my let me see. What would uh I think if Jack Vance is kind of like my stuff. Uh uh I really like if I'm reading like what I would consider like trash fiction is probably gonna be Jack Vance or some of that like dying world stuff. Um so have you read Art in the Working Class by Bognikov? No, I have not. I've read some other stuff by Bognikov. Bognikov. I've actually not said that name out loud much. Yeah. I think David Foster Wallace's essays, not his fiction, his essays, and maybe some of his short stories are a guilty pleasure. I hate to be that dude. I really kind of do, but it is. Um, you are a lit philosophy nerd when your guilty pleasures Ezra Pound and not Grey's Anatomy. Yeah. If like I really like bad stand-up, guys. That's when I like decompress. You know what I listen to when I decompress? I'm either watching stand-up or I'm like listening to like whether the podcast I listen to, because you guys be surprised. I don't listen to a lot of left-wing podcasts. Scary Tales Told in the Dark and the No Sleep podcast, and there's a right-wing art podcast that I really like, although they won't say they're right-wing, but they kind of only have right-wing guests. The Art of Darkness, I really like that podcast, even though their politics are sus. Um, uh, and I really like Clay Temple Media. Their politics are not sus. They're pretty cool. What else do I listen to a lot of? Let's see. Uh, I listen to this liberal god awful movies podcast a lot because it makes me laugh. I love William Volman. I love William Volman so fucking much. Like I don't I like he says some reactionary things sometimes. Actually, I mean he's got some weird opinions on Marx, for example, that shows up and rising down. Um. Uh. So yeah. But I love William Volman so much. His Carbon Ideologies book is like bleak, but I tell people to read that all the time. Um, uh, let's see, what have I listened to? I mean, like the comedy I like. I mean, I like some of the stuff you're supposed to like. I like Tig Notaro, but I also do like Doug Stanhope, even though he's an edgelord. Yeah, no, Volman is a maximalist. Like he makes like okay, how many of you have actually read my poetry? Because people complain that my poetry is maximalistic, and I always like go like read William Volman and come back to me. Um, is it true that you're really good? No, I'm not good at Fortnite. I do not play that many video games at all. Um, uh, yeah, I think Bill Hicks has aged mediumly poorly. um, so, uh, but yeah, Volman. Uh, who else have I listened to recently that was really funny? Um, Joshua Johnson, even though he's a Daily Show guy, I actually found his comedy special pretty good. Um, but I mean, I grew up in the '90s, so like a lot of the stuff I like used to listen to was like Dennis Leary, when I was a kid. Um, yeah. Thank you guys for letting me bring out my literary nerdness because, like, I do have like several degrees in English. I always tell people it's weird. I mean, I'm a union organizer, but I'm also a poet. Like, that's actually what I'm trained in. I'm trained in philosophy and anthropology and poetry and fiction. Except I don't write fiction because I used to write fiction. Yeah, he is an asshole, totally an asshole. I'm just saying that because that was the comedy milieu I came up in, was like this weird libertarian shit. I do not care about keeping up on TIR, man. I like going in there being clueless a lot of the time. I love Jason Miles to death. I consider that man a friend. We've hung out in person. Like, I really like Jason, but like, um, uh, I am so out of their cultural milieu, except on like rock music and shit. Like, I grew up listening to a lot of the same music. Oh, John Ashbery book. You guys, you got me like really thinking. Oh, I kind of like the one everybody likes, like Portrait in a Convex Mirror. Fuck, I know that's a basic bitch answer. And yes, I like. I'm almost one of those nerds who really likes McCarthy, and I like, have read Blood Meridian like 3 times, and like, yeah. I threatened to do more literary stuff, perhaps with JG. We are doing more stuff on behind the Patreon wall with JG. I'm supposed to do a special on Rob Zombie sometime soon. And I also really like Pinchon. I know, I'm a big fan Pinchon. The fiction that I like the most is Umberto Eco, and then I love Bowman. I think Le Guin's decent. I also think she's kind of overrated. I like Pinchon a lot, and I like Don DeLillo, and I like Cormac McCarthy. I like Zadie Smith's work. Okay, I don't really agree with her politics at all, but my favorite novel is Foucault's Pendulum, which I think is actually a response to something like Gravity's Ramrolls. But yeah, favorite horror film. Oh my god, Possession. That Sam Neill, Isabel, what's her, Johnny movie. It's also about the Cold War and also has weird lover eating Cthulhu beast in it. It's one of the weirdest fucking movies I've ever watched, but I fucking love it. I'm like obsessed with it. My other favorite horror film, I'm a weirdo, but I really, 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 really like Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. I just have a like I can listen to Werner Herzog talk about the terrors of the universe all day. And I really like early John Carpenter a lot, but everybody does. Does anyone know this movie, The Addiction? It's from the 90s. It's a vampire movie. I think it finally got a decent print released. It was hard to see for a long time. It is an Abel Ferrara and Nicholas St. John movie. I fucking love that movie. It was one of my favorite movies when I was a teenager. I think I saw it in 1996 when I was 16 years old. No, Bully is not in that one. Christopher Walken is, though. But yeah, The Addiction, that's another movie. And I don't think a lot of people have watched it. So I would tell you, like, if you want to watch that, it's a pretty fucking good movie. It's got Lily Tyler in it, I think. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I always wanted to be like, I I even like his weird, like, he's got this Iraq war that he turns into, like, where he's just voicing over like weird apocalyptic shit that has nothing to do with the Iraq war. Do I like Adam Curtis? Okay. This was always a debate between me and Doug Lane. I think Adam Curtis uses documentary footage from the BBC to seem to make an argument, but when you actually break down what he's doing, he has implied an argument and papered over the fact he hasn't made an argument by bombarding you with documentary prior footage. Yeah, The Hunger has Bowie in it. I like that movie too. A lot. The Bowie vampire movie from the 80s. It's like the most 80s fucking thing ever. But I didn't watch I haven't watched like recent Farrar movie. I mean, you know, Herzog is weird. But yeah, the other thing is though, I can watch an Adam Curtis movie and be mesmerized by it and feel like I learned something. But then when I break down the yes, I do like Kawanasquatsi. I have those two. When I break down what he's actually arguing, I'm often less impressed. And yeah, I think there is like, there's also this Graybarite hypervoluntarism in it, but a refusal to deal with social structures directly. Yeah, you know. And you feel like you've watched an argument when you watch an Adam Curtis movie, but then you like actually kind of construct it and you're like, nah. Yeah, he's a vibes-based movie director. You know, my friend, my frenemy of the show, Doug Lane, very clearly stole his image style from Adam Curtis. But anyway, anyone read Three Body Problem and see I haven't seen a Netflix series. I have read one, and I think I've read that book. But I haven't watched the Netflix series. Does anyone watch the Netflix series? Yeah, I've heard that China has better sci-fi writers. I'm waiting for more stuff to get translated from Chinese. You know, maybe the current political environment makes that really hard. But there's like, I want more stuff from Chinese. I want to understand, like, and I know it's hard to translate Mandarin and English, right? But like, what fiction that you hate but everyone else loves? Oh God. It's tough. That's easier with poetry, but it's harder with fiction. You know, I think Gillian Friend's a little overweighted. Do you remember Gillian Flynn? But I feel like her books have kind of fallen out of favor. Like she was all the rage a decade ago, but she was kind of like not a huge thing. I remember just being kind of mad on Rachel Kushner's The Flamethrowers, and I feel bad about that because I have like some, like, I know people who know her. Gillian Flynn. You know, David Fincher made a movie out of Gone Girl. You know that person. Yeah. Thank you guys. I'm gonna wrap this up because it's been almost 3 hours, and I've heard good things about the new Kushner book. I need to read it. I haven't read it yet. Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like every time I talk shit about someone who goes on Antifada, I'm like, oh man, we know the same people. Fuck. So you know. Have you seen The Reason Furiosa movie? No, because a lot of people who I thought who told me that it wasn't as good But I've also heard the opposite point of view. I need to watch it. I like Upon a Winter, the Traveler book by Italiano Calvino, but I think I read it when I was like 17 years old, and I got it from a school library, and you know, because I would just when I was in when I was in high school, I would just go to like the school library and grab what the fuck ever looked interesting off the shelf. So I read all kinds of weird stuff. All right, we're having a Furiosa battle. So we got 3 it sucks and 4 it's good. Okay, well I definitely got to watch it and make a call. So the Politburo of movie House of Leaves is kind of, I haven't reread. I loved House of Leaves. I remember when I was in Korea, I would talk to this Italian professor friend of mine about House of Leaves over and over and over again. But I've read other of Mark Danielewski's other books, and they were so bad that it made me rethink House of Leaves as actually being good. So it's one of those problems. Yeah, I've been recovering. I'm not going to go into my health problems on air because that can be used against you in a court of law or whatever. But I am getting better. I'm on a super restrictive diet, and I have been limited in the kinds of exercise I can do. But I am getting better. If you're trying to teachers programs or anything like that, you need anything like that. If you ever want suggestions to like argue with your pedagogy professors with, I got the stuff. Is Mike Flanagan overrated? No, I think he's precisely rated. The fact that we divide, I think he is basically everyman Stephen King, which is already Stephen King, and some of that is shit, and some of that is good, and some of Mike Flanagan's stuff is shit, and some of it is good. I have Red Star. I hate to admit that I have not finished it. Intermittent fasting. I'm a diet controlled diabetic, so I can't really do that. But I also don't eat a lot of carbs. But anyway, I'm not giving you guys health advice. I refuse to be that fucking kind of influencer. Don't listen to me about health. Just be healthy. Talk to your doctor. Whatever. Oh God, I did a whole show on Confederate of Dunces, like with the first year I did the Patreon. I fucking love that book. It's a weird reactionary book, but I fucking love it. And like you guys know that I grew up between Macon and Milledgeville. Like those two cities were the cities I lived in as a kid. And there's a weird relationship of the author Confederacy of Dunces to Milledgeville because he took his book to Flannery O'Connor to get it published before he died. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, which is better, Long Sun? Ooh, you're asking me Gene Wolfe questions. Okay, Long Sun. Although I do like the New Sun, but the Long Sun. I think the Long Sun's the better, weirder book. So, yeah. Someone asked me if I'm a Nathan Fielder fan. It will be the last thing I say. I haven't watched enough to know. All right. So check out his new special on HBO. Okay. We'll do that. All right. Good night, people. Bye-bye.